Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. This week I'm looking to cover St. Brigid. St. Brigid is actually one of my favourite holidays, especially Saints' holiday, because I can really get into my own culture in a way, I suppose we can word it like that. Because normally, especially when I was a kid, I used to wake up early in the morning, perfectly in sunrise, the sun's coming up, the winter is starting to come to an end, although it's still perfect because you got all the frost all over the garden and stuff. And you go down for breakfast and you have the beautiful, gorgeous orange juice, and then you've got the traditional Irish breakfast, the full Irish breakfast. Absolutely brilliant. And then you'd go into school then. And if you didn't know what an Irish breakfast is, by the way, a full Irish breakfast, if you haven't been to Ireland, vacationing in Ireland and you haven't had the full Irish breakfast, first thing you're going to have to do when you do get to Ireland, try out the full Irish breakfast. It is absolutely gorgeous. It's my favourite traditional meal. When it comes down to the bread and the sausages, the whole shebang, absolutely gorgeous. It's one thing I do miss from home. As you know yourself, I'm over in Japan right now. Food over here is amazing. Gonna miss it if I go back to Ireland, but I do miss Irish food as well. And Irish breakfast this time of the year on the 1st of February for St. Bridget's Day is one thing I definitely miss. Furthermore, when we used to go into school then, we used to go and make St. Bridget crosses. When I was in primary school, we were all taught how to make a St. Bridget cross. If I grab my one there, where did I put my one? Ah, there it is. If we look at the St. Bridget cross, this is a small little one my wife made, and it's really easy to make. Absolutely brilliant stuff. But that's what we used to make all day when we were in school, is to spend a good hour before doing a little bit of Irish history, obviously my favourite, doing the Old English, and then in between maths as well, we'd go off and start making St. Bridget crosses. And I absolutely loved it. I used to love it every single time because it was that hour rest in between everything else, in between English. It was mostly covered during history class, we'd do it. Once again, one of my favourite things. And in school, and as I got older, the debate used to get bigger and bigger, and now the debate is very much gone the other way. And then what debate is it, you're wondering? Well, first off, a lot of people debate, was St. Bridget real? And when I was a child, it was very much going to a Irish school. When I lived in Cork between the ages of 1 to 7, I went to an Irish school, and then I went off to Mallow and I went to a Catholic school and stuff. And it always was that St. Bridget was real. She was a real life person. So I kind of always just treated her like a real life person. But as I got older, people started to question the literature. And a lot of people started to see a lot of similarities between the real life St. Bridget, if she was real or not, and a goddess also called Bridget. I personally, even today, and maybe I'm biased because of the way I grew up and was raised, and it was my own grandmother and my own mother that raised me with their history as well, and they believed that St. Bridget was real. My grandmother told me a lot of stories on St. Bridget, so maybe I'm biased, but listen to me anyway, and listen to my point of view, and then I want to know your point of view, so definitely leave a comment below, because this is what I'm passionate about, and I want to know what kind of views people have. So if you come into this conversation with an already biased view, you've already gone through all the history and the literature, you're probably wondering, okay, why do I think St. Bridget is real? And the reason for it is that even from her birth all the way up to her death, if you strip away everything that's added on, because I know firsthand there's a lot of stuff that's added on, especially the fact that St. Bridget was born in 451. And for a lot of people still today brand this as the Dark Ages. Me personally, because I have, once again, a biased Irish view, I see this as Ireland coming into the Golden Age. So I would never refer to 451 as the Dark Ages. But I understand people's interpretation. I mean, this is the age of King Arthur. We don't know if King Arthur is real. We definitely know Attila the Hun is real. Sure, he burned his way through Europe. And this is the period when he's doing so. But the likes of St. Bridget and King Arthur, we have very little to no evidence. But where King Arthur is a funny character that we solidly can't find, St. Brigid, I feel she fits way too much into the history. And what I am saying is the fact that, first off, although a lot of Christians try to, ignore this part, St. Brigid's mother was a slave. She was a slave taken from modern day Scotland, which at the time was called Pictland. And she was a Pictish woman. And that's because at the time, Ireland, the Gaelic people, were in Scotland, invading Scotland. They were taking territory. And eventually, Gaelic culture would dominate Scotland. At the time, the main raiders, as we would call the raiders that come down from Scandinavia today, Vikings, at the time period itself, the raiders that were going from Ireland, the Gaelic, into Scotland were called the Scotti. And so there, that's where the name of modern day Scotland comes from. That's why it used to be called Pictland, but now it's called Scotland. Because at the time, the Gaelic were pushing in. And this was happening all in 451. So it's very much fitting into what's going on. So the Gaelic go in, the Scotti, and they start to take lots of slaves. And they bring them back to Ireland, to places around where modern day Dublin is, and Tara, and Meath, and up around. Now Dublin at the time, don't get me wrong, a few of you say, oh, well, Dublin was built by the Vikings. Yes, it was. But you've got earlier settlements around that area. Is it the Adonian, were a clan that was very much around that area that was trading with the Roman Empire. But they weren't trading in Dublin itself. That Dublin itself now wouldn't be built until the Vikings come over. Regardless, that whole place of Leinster was all used to trade slaves, and the slave market in Ireland was what profit all the Gaelic going into Scotland, and they were also going into Wales and fighting the Romans. And that's why when we look at finds today in Ireland, we can find Roman pottery, we can find Roman swords, we can find loads of Roman equipment, because that's what the Scotti were doing, the Irish. They were going into modern day Wales, where the Romans were, and they were beating them, and they were not only, they were trading as well, but they would have beaten them and taken the loot and used that stuff. Now, it's also possible that you had Gaelic that served in the Roman Empire. I've had previous guests on before that really do believe in that. And me personally, I do believe that there were Scotti that served in the Roman Empire as well. That's why suddenly the Scotti were so good at fighting Romans, because they knew their tactics. And if they're taking their weapons to use, that means they're pretty much fighting a Gaelic Roman army. Not to the standard of the Romans. The Romans were very good. The Romans came out of Italy and had lots of experience using those type of tactics, so on and so forth. But the Scotti were getting there. Regardless, this was a period when Brigid's wife was Brigid's mother, but then regardless, she was taken back to Ireland, her mother was, and she was a slave of a king of Leinster. And the king of Leinster, from my understanding now, when I'm going through the literature, the king of Leinster was a very horrible man. He used to try to beat poor Brigid when she was born. And so I can't imagine what St. Brigid's mother went through. And this is why a lot of people argue then, how could St. Brigid's mother be a Christian? And Christianity was just getting here, there and everywhere. Don't get me wrong, I do believe the majority were pagans, but me personally, because St. Brigid's mother was going through so much, now she was being traded, I don't want to sound, you see, how do I word this now? I don't want to sound awful, but she was being traded amongst men, and she was a slave. So I don't have to explain, let's just say horrible things would happen to St. Brigid's mother. Regardless, and I wouldn't be the biggest Christian or pagan or anything. I'm very much, enjoy everything, I'm very non-biased when it comes down to that thing, Regardless, I do think when it comes down to solid faith, Christianity really is good at that. And I do believe in her darkest hour. And I'm not saying God is real or anything like that. What I'm saying is in her darkest hour, she very much turned to God to keep herself going through all of this that was going on to her, right? And obviously she became pregnant with Brigid, and Brigid was born into slavery, right? Now, what I wanted to find out next was what happened to St. Brigid's mother. sadly, the only thing I could find, except for an added bit of folklore that St. Brigid eventually went off, found her mother, and bought her years later, I sadly don't think that happened. What I could find was that later on, the King of Leinster, who owned St. Brigid's mother at the time, had then sold her off to a druid. So she was being still sold and traded amongst men, which is very depressing stuff. But as dark and gritty as it is, that's why I sort of do believe that St. Brigid was real. As warped as it is, because that's reality. That's just the hard facts of things. So I do believe that was real, because that's what was happening in Ireland at the time. We were not, although we're going into the period of saints and scholars, this was a hard, brooding time, and we would say about what the horrible English did to us later on and stuff, but at the time, in this period, we were doing some hard, horrific things to people, and that's just what we were doing, and that's the period we lived in. Regardless, what happened to Brigid? Brigid was born the daughter of the King of Leinster. So the King of Leinster took her in, but she might as well have been no daughter of his, because from my understanding, he did not treat her very well whatsoever. There's a very good example of when he was going to it wasn't the King of Leinster, it was the chieftain of Leinster, owned St. Brigid, and then he was going off to see the King of Leinster. That's it. Regardless, he went off to see the King of Leinster one day. St. Brigid's dad did. And while he was doing so, St. Brigid actually sold his sword. Now, if you know anything about swords and stuff, they are very expensive. And her being a daughter of a low-class slave from Pickland, her father was not a happy man. And he was going out to beat her severely. Possibly even beat her half to death, or maybe just full on kill her with a stone to the back of the head or something. Regardless, he had to be talked out of it by his superior, the King of Leinster. Had to talk him out of beating his own daughter. And you get that image straight away that he was not a nice man, not a polite man whatsoever. So that's the kind of rearing poor St. Brigid had. And one day, St. Brigid's father wanted to marry her off, to get rid of her. At the time, most men had to pay to get rid of their daughters, and guaranteed St. Brigid's dad would have been one of those men. He would have tried to get rid of her no matter what, because although she was meant to be, according to the literature, a very good dairy farmer, that's what she was used for most of the time, was just dumped onto the field to work with the cattle and stuff, to milk cows, and she was meant to be exceptionally well at it. Regardless, he didn't care. He wanted to get rid of this woman. And so what he did then was try to, probably sell her off to another man, through marriage and stuff. But with the dowry, as it was called, there was no real difference really. And that this went up all the way up to the 80s and 90s, that families would put together a dowry, and then they would use that then to try to get rid of their daughter. Imagine that today. Imagine people trying to do that today. Completely unacceptable behaviour, but that was the times. Regardless, getting back onto the story, St. Brigid wasn't having any of this. So what she did was that she would skip on town. She would literally get on out of there, and she went off and she joined the church. Now, before going into the church, Brigid's fate would have been all over the place. She would have been just a typical teenager from my understanding. Going through the literature and stuff, there's no solid... I know there is beforehand that she was always... There's one literature I read, and she was supposedly always the devout Christian, God was... But from my understanding from literature I was going through, I just didn't get that image of her. She just appeared to be just a regular teenager, to be honest with you, up in the fairies. And then when she needed then God to be on her side in church, she... straight into the church. And at the time, as I was saying before, the church wasn't popular. Mostly everybody was pagan, but Christianity was really starting to take root. And so St. Brigid went off and she joined the church. And from there, she got on very popular. She was very good at working with the church and stuff. And so very quickly, she became the woman. She became the woman to go to for everything. Any problem that needed to be solved, St. Brigid could solve that problem. She was the go-to woman in the church. And eventually, St. Brigid wanted to go off and make her own she wanted to go off and make her own church dedicated to women. And so she went over to the King of Leinster once again, and she asked for a tiny bit of territory in Kildare. And the King of Leinster turned around to her and says, no, we need a bit of land. And she says, only a tiny bit of land. I just need a tiny bit of land to build a little church. Now, later folklore will make out that she wanted a ton of acres of land, and she wanted to build a big massive cathedral that we see today in Kildare. I don't think that's the case either, to be honest with you. If you look at most churches at the time, they're very tiny, and if you think further into this, that would make sense, because her cloak, okay, I think she did do a little bit of a trick, to be honest with you. I think she had a little cloak wrapped around her, and then she unraveled it, because basically what she said to the King of Leinster was, could I have a bit of land that could only fill my cloak, right? So she pulled out the cloak, and it ended up being longer than what it looked like when it was folded up and broached here, right? So it was wrapped around her and the brooch was here. And when she said, oh, can I just have a bit of land that covers my cloak? And the King of Leinster just laughed and said, sure, fine. If you can have whatever land fills that cloak, okay? So she undid it, whipped it out, and it ended up being longer than what it was. That's my interpretation of the literature. And if you look at solid facts, because churches were a lot smaller then than they are now. So I reckon she did do a little bit of a trick on the King of Leinster, and she ends up with enough land to build a small little church for a few women, okay? Because as I said earlier, there's only a few Christians at the time, because paganism still dominates the land. Regardless, Brigid was very popular, especially around that whole area. Kildare is one of those main points. There's a main road going across. Kildare is connected over to the centre of Ireland, which at the time was Clonmacnoise. It's easy to get over to Dublin. So what happened was it didn't take very long for Brigid to become a people person, especially with the kind of, social skills that she had. She was able to socialise quite easily. And she was, compared to St. Patrick beforehand, who was a foreigner into the country, St. Brigid was one of them. She was one of the Irish, right? She was a woman from the Leinster area, you know. Even if her mother was a slave, that wasn't the point. She was pretty much one of the Irish. And so very quickly she got on with everybody. And so then she ends up getting more and more followers, especially if you had followers that were trying to get away from marriage for one, or a terrible family that was treating her horrible, because women didn't have it nice back then. So you could expect a lot of women to try to escape the society that they were and go off and join the nunnery, because that's pretty much what St. Brigid's church was. It would have been what we would consider today a nunnery. So a lot of women are escaping and joining up with St. Brigid in her little church. And over time, guaranteed, she would have built up on that as well. So she would have built more homes. She would have built, places for them to stay and stuff. And it seems like that in the literature. Now, St. Brigid, she, from the actual literature I could get a hold of that made more sense of her, she didn't really seem to be a Brigid that flew into the air with psychic powers and stuff, shooting beams out of her eyes and breathing fire. That doesn't seem to be the St. Brigid I was getting from the literature anyway. The St. Brigid I was getting was more of a human being. For example, one day, and will be slightly controversial, especially given the times and stuff with abortion, because that's what I'm talking about now, is abortion. And just to break this down to what their point of view was at the time in medieval Ireland, and I'm talking about medieval Ireland now, I'm not talking about anywhere else in Europe, I'm talking about medieval Ireland. Abortion was frowned upon, but people were having abortions anyway because they were looking to survive. And straight away you must be like, what do you mean survive? Children cost a lot of money, and they cost a lot of food. And when you're dealing with a period when people are trying to actually survive difficult and hard winters, when there's a lack of food and resources, many families, especially struggling families, will not have the resources to survive. Furthermore, you would have had women that needed to be a virgin. They needed to go into a marriage a virgin, and bring on an alliance with another strong family to survive against raiding families that would go onto their territory, take what they had, and possibly even kill them. They needed to make strong alliances. If that woman wasn't a virgin, it could cause problems. That was the times they lived in. And St. Brigid knew this. And St. Brigid was a very educated woman. So, as we've seen in the literature, there are women that have gone to St. Brigid, and other people and priests as well, in that period of the early medieval Ireland, and asked for abortions. And although the church has said, and I'm talking about the Irish church now, has turned around and said it would much rather adopt children, they understand that at times abortion is necessary. It's not good in their view. I'm not talking about my view or anything. I'm just talking about their view. So we can find in literature where women have gone to St. Brigid to have abortions, and St. Brigid fully understood, and that's what she did. She put various herbs together, and she would make them drink the herb, which would remove the child, and then that woman then would stay with St. Brigid for a certain period of time, possibly a year, staying on bread and water, and that would be her way of kind of doing penance, because they still viewed it as murder. That was their point of view. Now, I'm not saying my point of view of any of this, because that's a very modern point of view, and I don't want to criticize people of that period, okay? Depending on what your point of view is. Because in this channel we're mostly dedicated to looking at this from a medieval point of view, not from a modern point of view, because then things can get very blurry. Regardless, Saint Brigid was a complicated person, and she wouldn't have had the extreme leftist idea either of, abortions are good, so on and so forth, because there are times, for example, it got to her word as she got older, because she spent years there, and she was a very active woman and stuff. And so she lived way up to her 80s, her 70s, 80s, around that time frame. She lived a very long time. And so when she got old then, it did get to her ear one day that there was a certain girl that wanted to sneak out to see a certain lad. Now, once again, I don't have to talk about the bees and nature and all that stuff. We all know what she was up to, right? St. Brigid wasn't happy about this. This is a much older St. Brigid now. And so what she did was that she put hot burning coal into her leather shoes, because back then you had to make your own leather shoes. Everybody knew how to make their own shoes. You did have people who specialized in making fancy shoes and stuff, but especially St. Brigid's followers, they wouldn't have had the money for that, and so they would have made their own shoes. And she would have got the hot coal and put it into this leather, and then this poor young girl, who was just, in my opinion, she was just out to see a fucking young fella, went to put her feet into the shoes. She burned the feet off herself, and she couldn't walk. She burned the feet off herself, and she quickly got into bed then, because she was again screaming and stuff. And St. Brigid told her, I did this for your own good. It got rid of the lust. And it literally says that in the literature. And she says, and I reckon, although the literature makes it out somewhat that it's very much like, oh, thank you, St. Brigid, for getting rid of that lust, I reckon it was more kind of, thanks a lot, St. Brigid. Thanks for doing that for me now. You're a brilliant old woman, aren't you? I reckon it was more like that. That's why I personally do believe, because the very early literature is really down to earth, I do believe that she was real. But, don't get me wrong, when people are turning around and comparing her to the goddess Brigid, I also agree with them as well. Now, St. Brigid lived, she was born in 451, she lived about 80 years, and then she passed away, right? In her period, no one turned around and thought that she was so great, we're going to dedicate an annals to her, we're going to write an entire bibliography on her. So she wasn't written about, she was just a great woman. But her stories continued, because it's like, oh, remember the times of St. Brigid, oh, St. Brigid said this, St. Brigid said that, she was a fantastic woman. I reckon over time, first off foremost, over time people added more stories to it. I remember the time when St. Brigid flew into the air. Oh yeah, they might be having a laugh at a guy who just came to visit them, but that guy who came to visit them might take it seriously. Regardless, The next thing you know, before you get up to 700, 800, they're starting to write it down because, whoa, it's like St. Brigid, she's an amazing woman. This is also the period when you have the goddess Brigid, right? And I do believe, because at the time as well, you do have women who were just called Brigid. Brigid is a very popular name in Ireland at this period, and it still is today. You still get a good few girls called Brigid. Anyway, I personally believe that Saint Brigid may have been then taken on by a later writer that wanted to remember everything about the goddess, because you have a lot of, especially Christian writers, they know what's coming. They know Rome, Christian Rome wants to get rid of all this different form of paganism and stuff. So you have a few cute Christians who respect our ancestors' ways, their ancestors' cultures, so they want to document all this. So what they decide to do is they get a woman that's very popular who happens to be called Brigid, and they mix the two together. They get the goddess Brigid and a woman that's very popular called Brigid, and later on they merge the two of them together. That's what I reckon happened, and that's the point where you get a Brigid that suddenly is the saint of all these things this goddess used to cover, because the idea that a Celtic goddess covers a certain specific thing, like the Morgan, she is the goddess of war, that's a very modern interpretation taken from the Roman gods. So even at the time when the Romans are occupying various places in Europe, the Romans are trying to get Celtic gods. They want pagans to continue worshiping pagans back in the pagan period when they still have Roman paganism and stuff, but they want to make them Roman. So they get that god and they Romanize it. So before you know it, that Celtic god is suddenly, although still going through its Celtic name, has an identity. You know, it's the god of fire. So when people turn around and say, oh, Saint Brigid is the god of such and such a thing, right? And she covers so much. That's more of a Roman interpretation. So she suddenly became the saint of common sense, which quite literally is. Some people are put her down as the saint of common sense, the saint of travelers, the saint of a flame. And the reason why she covers so much is because the original Celts didn't have labels for their gods. This is a later introduction by the Romans. So that's why St. Brigid covers so much today. And that's why when they were documenting her, they merged her together. An actual human being merged from a Celtic goddess from a very Roman perspective. And that's why she covers so much, as I said, like 3 or 4 times already now. St. Brigid also apparently passed away on the 1st of February, which is the same date. And it's very funny, we're not sure when she was born. We assume she was born around 451. But what they're solid about was that she passed away on the 1st of February. Very interesting, because that's the same day that we have Imbolc on the 1st of February. So you can kind of put the two of them together. And still today, because it's Ireland and everyone likes a good story, they always add on to the story and they always change the story. So although you may have heard my version of the story, I want to hear what you've heard, because there are thousands of ways to tell the St. Brigid story, and neither one is better than the other one. Well, it depends on your point of view. Which did you find entertaining, really? Because there's always a good storyteller will take it off. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'm going to enjoy St. Brigid's Day. Make sure to make a good few St. Brigid's cross. I will be not enjoying a full Irish breakfast this year, sadly. Hopefully, maybe next year, we'll see. Or I found a place that does full Irish breakfasts in Japan, perhaps. We'll see. I have no idea what the future will bring. I still will be doing the Irish t-shirts and stuff. What I am actually doing, lads, because it's just myself and Michael that are doing the t-shirts, I will be gathering up all the names. So if you leave a comment below, if we don't have your name, leave a comment below if you haven't already, because we'll be going through all the old videos as well, going through all the comments of who left the comment looking for their surname and stuff. So don't panic, don't worry, you don't even have to leave a comment. I'll go and find it later. But leave a comment below if you're looking for a t-shirt off me. But anyway, I also have the Instagram up and going as well, so make sure to subscribe to the Instagram. Myself and Michael are over on Facebook on Clans and Dynasties, so make sure to like us over there and have a chat. Join our community, have a chat with us. We're always anytime you want. Either myself or Michael are awake. Michael's still over in Ireland, so he's awake during those times, and I'm awake in Japan. So regardless, we got you covered. We'll get in contact with you whenever you're up for a chat. Anyway, I hope you're all the best, and make sure you subscribe and like. See you later, lads. Bye.